Hi all, thank you for joining today's webinar. Today, the 3KL team will be talking through our perspective on the role of business in halting deforestation. Before we start, I'll just cover some housekeeping briefly. We will start with a presentation for around 40 minutes. We're keen for this to be a two-way discussion, so there will be an opportunity to have your say in a poll around halfway through. We'll also be finishing with a Q&A. I'd encourage you to add questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to make these anonymous if you wish. I'll be reviewing them throughout the session and then posing them to our panel at the end of today's webinar. Finally, just to mention that all the information presented today is publicly available and you are very welcome to reference it in other conversations that you may have. I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues who will be presenting today. Will Schreiber is a director here at 3KL. He is a convener for the Retail Soy Group, facilitator for the Palm Oil Transparency Coalition, and involved in a number of projects with retailers and FMCG companies as well, focused on halting deforestation in commodity supply chains. Anna is a special advisor, an expert in deforestation risk policy and strategy. She has an extensive background in international conservation and sustainable development initiatives. I'm Ruth, a senior consultant, and I'm currently project managing a number of work streams supporting FMCG clients with mitigating deforestation and preparing for the upcoming EUDR legislation. We'll also be joined today at the tail end of our presentation by Nicola Brennan, who is the DCAF supply chain specialist at WWF, and she'll be sharing her perspectives and reflections. So very briefly, a little bit about 3KL for those who may not be familiar with us. We are a sustainability consultancy specializing in supply chains, food systems, and landscapes. We have a fairly unique position when it comes to thinking about the role of businesses when it comes to deforestation, as we have a number of different business units who are specialists in different areas. For example, we have the agriculture and land team who focus on better production practices, through to the climate and nature and resources team who work closely with corporates on strategies and sustainability plans. Will, Anna, and myself primarily focus our time in the commodity supply chains team, where we help businesses mitigate deforestation, environmental and human rights risks. We also work with companies to improve traceability and drive sustainable initiatives. We work across both the direct and indirect challenges in the soft commodity space. So hopefully a number of you will have seen that we've recently published a white paper on this topic. Today we'll be talking through some of the key themes at a high level. This report comes after a decade of the 3KL team working with businesses to mitigate deforestation. We have now assessed and monitored the policies and actions of more than 1,000 companies involved in both the trade and production of consumer production containing deforestation risk commodities. This has been through the 3KL data services, which we've done over the last 9 years. We also engage traders through the Palm Oil Transparency Coalition, the Retailer Cocoa Collaboration, and the Soy Transparency Coalition. We assess over 300 criteria, and we've been doing this over 7 years. So we have been able to see how things have changed or not, as the case may be. We also facilitate pre-competitive collaborations like the Retail Soy Group, and we also have Compass, which is a due diligence resource to help companies monitor the indirect supply chains to ensure they're compliant with company expectations of deforestation and social requirements. So as we near the end of 2025, a real milestone year for many companies and their commitments to deforestation, it feels like a timely opportunity to think about the future of companies when it comes to halting deforestation. So an overview of today's session. Before we look ahead, Anna is going to start with where we are today in terms of deforestation and commitments globally. She'll then reflect and we'll get your thoughts on the main initiatives that have been at play in the past couple of decades, how effective they have been, and considering which ones still hold potential. Will then take us through where, from a 3KL perspective, we believe efforts should be focused in the coming years. Finally, Nicola will close by sharing WWF's perspective, and then we'll move on to Q&A. So I'll now hand over to Anna.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. It's really nice to have so many people here today. Brilliant. So, I mean, standing here at the sort of close to the end of 2025, it's been a big year that's kind of appeared a lot in various commitments over the years, which is why we thought it was a really good opportunity and very timely to be looking backwards and looking forwards in terms of that stock take, in this milestone year. So some of the kind of commitments that have been out there, some of them have been related to, sort of particular supply chains. So the UK Soil Manifesto had 2025 as a, big target date for achieving, deforestation conversion-free supply into the UK market. The Accountability Framework Initiative has really held up 2025 as that milestone year. And so therefore a lot of corporate commitments have very much aligned, with that kind of good practice sense. This was the big ambition. And then for the Science Based Targets Initiative, for anyone who set forest, land use and agriculture targets under that, again, 2025 has very much been the ambition. There's been various other sort of, bigger frameworks that again are very much holding 2025 as a really key year and one that's worthy of, sort of additional attention and focus. The European Green Deal obviously was intended as a major package of policy measures. It has targets and ambitions out to 2030 and out to 2050, but 2025 there was sort of real milestones in place. Similarly, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's SDG 15, which is the one about life on land. 2030 is the sort of absolute date for the target for deforestation to have been ended, but seeing 2025 as a real important year to check in and assess progress. And for anyone who was following the UN Climate Summit in Brazil this year, you'll know that 2025 there was a new round of the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, that were being tabled to understand what our member countries intending to do in terms of their climate ambition looking ahead. So it's been a huge year with a real ambition that we would have achieved deforestation and conversion-free supply chains. So where have we got to? Unfortunately, the picture is, as it will come as no surprise to anyone on this call, but it doesn't get any easier to say it. We are way off track. Deforestation continues to be ongoing. Looking at the map on the left of this slide, this sort of looks at the average across the past 3 years. There are notable signs of progress, I think, in some places. It looks like there's been real steps forward in Indonesia in bringing down deforestation. There are countries that are, managing to, with sort of different combinations of initiatives to make progress on how they address deforestation. But the overwhelming overall picture is not a good one. And we can see that, looking at the sort of projections of where we were back in 2020 and getting down to zero by 2030, deforestation and forest loss is way ahead of where it should be. And I think increasingly a lot of that forest loss is actually also coming from forest fires. Deforestation has always been a really complex issue. There's different drivers in different places, but I think forest losses has become a greater and greater issue. I think it was peaked in 2024, about 3.25 million hectares being lost. Some of that, I guess, in the boreal forest may recover, but in other areas it really is going to be setting it on the path towards that further deforestation. So I think it's a really important time to reflect. How are we making this trajectory towards 2030 and beyond? We've had deforestation on the agenda at the UN Climate Summit since 2005. It's been a very high topic of conversation in many forums. And there's been many different tools and mechanisms which are being tried globally, regionally, at different national levels in order to address it, which is why we thought it was important to understand what has been tried and what is working. Of course, the past couple of years has been, there is never any sort of constant, I suppose, so much as change, but it has felt particularly there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of policy and ways forward across both producer and sort of traditionally consumer countries around this space, around what's happening in deforestation. Brazil has sort of the climate COP was making real efforts to put deforestation on the agenda. What is the roadmap? What is the ambition? At the same time, domestically, there's been huge ongoing challenge to the Amazon soy moratorium, and different kinds of challenges there. enforcement remains a huge issue across many different producer countries as well. We also see, conflicting kinds of policy in Indonesia. There's been real advances and progress made in some areas to try to address deforestation. At the same time, ambitions around food security, bioenergy policy, it all, creates more uncertainty and less of a picture that we are only going to meet that target to have halted deforestation by 2030. On the consumer side, big swings politically, both in the European Parliament and in the US, different contradicting interests, and, where deforestation and sustainability and environmental issues sit more broadly in that agenda. It's a very contested space, and therefore it can make it more difficult, particularly when you're looking at long-standing issues, long-standing ambitions, and how you plot a course over sort of 10, 15 years, understanding what the policy context is. So with that sort of slightly bleak, I guess, stock take of where we stand at the moment, we haven't fixed the problem, but it's helpful, I think, to understand where we have been making progress, because while the overwhelming picture at the global level is not the one that we want to see, there are real kind of areas that we can see that there has been progress and things have been working. And I think comparing to the levels of deforestation that were happening in the 1980s and 1990s, it's a very different landscape that we're looking at now. So we were keen to sort of do a bit of a reflection backwards, basically, and see, well, how have we got here? What has been tried? What different tools have been out there? And have put together a bit of a timeline of some of the sort of key events, key things that have happened along this journey of the past 20 years and beyond, really, particularly looking at the forestry sector. It really has its roots in the 1990s. But just looking, sort of since 2000, we plotted out different things. The text may be too small for you to read here. You can sort of see the detail in the report, but you get this general picture of where things have evolved and moved forward and how they've spread across different regions, across different commodities, different things where actually this seemed to be working, and therefore we can see it's being, as an effort to replicate it or to scale it over time. And that was what really led us to start thinking about thinking about what's happened over the past 20 years into a series of different phases. And you can see how thinking has evolved, how ambitions have evolved, responding to success, failure, political shifts, technology changes, all of these different things that kind of come to play. But it was, sort of quite interesting looking back, I think, and trying to think about these different phases that we've seen. And really seeing, as I say, how you can look across the different commodities. We particularly were looking at palm, soy and cocoa in the report that we were looking at. There'd be, sort of similarities and parallels with other commodities that you might be looking at as well. So phase one really was, I think, certification was kind of seen as the big, really engaging with the markets, I suppose, and trying to get sustainability to have a real solid business case behind it, and to how we engage with that market pressure that has been such a driver of deforestation and forest loss in some of these key regions. And really the idea and the logic behind certification, as many of the people on the call will well know, it's about really trying to get that recognition of payment for improved practices, and that actually where you can provide that evidence that there is production being done in a more responsible way, in a more sustainable way, that needs to be rewarded. And it should be rewarded, and there is a willingness to reward it coming from the downstream end of the supply chain. So how do we connect the dots backwards? So I think certification, starting in the forestry sector with a lot of success, a lot of interest around efficacy and others that have emerged subsequently. That was sort of the model, really, I think, that was then used for palm with the founding of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And then again, it's something that, has been used a lot in the soy sector. It's been used in cocoa supply chains as well. But I think there's always been inherent, I think, limitations and challenges with some of these methodologies. And so as we sort of moved forwards, there was this recognition of the fact that actually probably more was going to be needed, possibly that replicating this model was not always going to be the right way forward. It wasn't always going to work across all supply chains. There are limitations, there are challenges, which I'll dig into a little bit more in a moment. So that was when we really started to see sort of, this phase, what we thought considered as phase two, which was in innovation and more initiatives emerging. So more sort of coalitions, the idea of, sort of jurisdictional level approaches. I think it really took root in sort of the mid 2010s. And really this sense of actually trying to get beyond individual sort of site level, which was really what certification was focused on, and starting to broaden out to look more at the landscapes, whether that was bounded as a jurisdiction or in some other way. And I think, again, with having seen this proliferation of, different ideas and different ambitions, there was a real sense of actually, can we also try to be bringing some of these together? But, let's test, let's see, are there different ways of doing this? Do we need to go through the sort of full certification route? Are there ways that we can do this more efficiently, more quickly? And trying to get really sometimes back to basics of what are we really trying to achieve here, so that we could really align commitments around core objectives and focus on really key actions that would help to move things forward, as much as allowing space for different ambition and different ideas to take hold. Then as we got to 2020, a lot of these sort of original targets and ambitions around tackling deforestation, certainly things that were framed into like the New York Declaration on Forests or in the SDGs, the aim and the real ambition originally was that 2020 we would have stopped commodity-linked deforestation. We obviously, unfortunately, didn't manage that, and I think one of the real barriers and the real challenges that people were struggling with around that time was around the traceability, being able to monitor, being able to evidence, even if you felt that you were moving in the right direction and there was progress being made, there was a real challenge to be able to demonstrate that. And similarly, for getting downstream actors to invest in what was really needed back up the supply chain, that business case is really difficult to make if you don't know really where your supply is coming from. So, pouring investment into particular focused landscapes where you can really see and support different patterns of production is one thing, whereas pouring funding into entire regions of the world, it's simply too diffuse, and that business case just doesn't make sense. So I think, particularly again with some of the advances we've seen of the huge reduction in cost and availability of data from things like remote sensing, it suddenly means that actually monitoring things like deforestation are becoming much more viable as options. They're much more credible as methodologies than they were sort of 5-10 years ago. But again, it's not got us to where we need to be, and it's where we're looking forward now to this idea of a phase 4. It's kind of what is the next evolution, and I would definitely sort of say evolution rather than revolution was our thinking with this paper. But how can we use these new tools, all the things that we've learned, the different approaches that are out there, as bring that sort of suite of tools together, join up these different approaches. How can we make sure that the way that business is operating aligns with its strengths? It makes sense. That's how we embed things really. We can embed them fully into operations where they align with the business case. But equally, this sense of nature needs to be at the core of it. We need to be really valuing what is delivering most value across different actors and across different dimensions, climate, people and nature together. So looking across these sort of different things, we group the different tools and approaches across these different phases, across 6 sort of core different mechanisms, I suppose, that were being used in terms of how we tackle deforestation. One of the ones that's often come up, repeatedly in different contexts has been around substitution. Could we simply stop using some of these commodities that are particularly linked to deforestation? And I know, we've seen over the years, sometimes there's been efforts for things like, calling for boycotts of palm oil use. It was, the best way to stop the deforestation is to stop using the palm oil, was the logic behind it. And we've seen that across all of these commodities. So for soy, we talk about, I've seen people talking about insect protein. It's a really horrible picture of some maggots. I had to crop it as small as I could. I couldn't bear to look at too much of it. But we've also just looked at different oil substitutions as well. Canola, rapeseed, different kinds of legumes. If it's feed that you're talking about, there's different options. For palm oil, there's been suggestions of different things that substitute for palm oil. Soy, I think, has probably been the one that's most commonly used, but also rapeseed and sunflower oil. Coconut oil, I think, sometimes comes into that as one that I've seen used as well. And then, more recently, I've seen, more things coming out of different kinds of cocoa substitutes. There are different things that we can use. And so carob, fermented grains, palm oil, I think, is a substitute for palm butter. Seeing more and more things being labelled as chocolate flavor coatings as opposed to chocolate coatings. And that's generally because of an increase in palm oil usage, I think, within their production. So it's one of the things that can be part of the mix. But with all of these commodities, we've never advocated for those boycotts, because actually engaging with these supply chains, which have been making real efforts around driving forward sustainability, that can be produced really efficiently, is going to be the more sustainable option in the long run for, being able to support these global supply chains. There's a huge social dimension of, if we start switching off supply for different kinds of commodities, we don't want to see that there is suddenly a collapse in the price or production of different commodities. It would have huge social impacts, and it will simply often, I think, sort of move the problem elsewhere. So there are going to be cases where things can be done more efficiently, and I think there are, opportunities around reformulations, exploring, new product development, all these sorts of things. But I think in terms of when you're looking at global deforestation, to us, this doesn't feel like it's really going to be the thing that's going to make the difference. And I think it would be a real loss of a lot of the work that's been done. Certification obviously has been, as I say, a huge tool for about 20 years or longer. And I think, in terms of demonstrating this business case of really showing how you can connect, end users, consumers, sometimes even the general public are recognizing logos on packet. For things like the FSC logo, I think it's one of the best recognized ones. You sometimes see the RSPO logo popping up on things. Fair trade, for cocoa, again, has, real awareness and understanding for people. There's many other different certification schemes that we use within the supply chain, particularly for soy, where a lot of that soy is an embedded use. People are buying the beef and the pork, they're not buying the soy. Anything with those sort of on-pack labelling, there's probably less of a logic behind it. But within the supply chain, it has huge meaning and it has huge traction. And I think it's been that real ability to sort of evidence credibly and to give reassurance that you are investing and you are rewarding improved production methods and improved practices. At the same time, there's always been challenges with certification. I think smallholder and the risks of them being excluded from supply chains because they simply can't meet the burden or the costs of the certification requirements. It's often down to the evidencing, it's down to the auditing. The smaller you are, the higher those costs effectively become relative to the revenues that you're generating. It's always been part of the conversation. It's not something that anyone involved in those certification schemes has not been sorely aware of and tried to address, but it remains a really challenging barrier to try to overcome. How do you get that evidence in place? How do you manage to do these things in a way which is not disproportionately impacting on smallholders? Similarly with certification, I think, you've got many different schemes, particularly with something like soy. I think one of the real challenges there has been there's many schemes, the scale of them is very difficult, and therefore maintaining that segregation down the supply chain, the costs become really prohibitive. I think with something like palm oil, RSPO, part of the reason it's been so successful is because it reached scale really, really quite quickly and really sort of dominated the conversation, and therefore actually switching whole refineries or, certainly whole mills over to being RSPO certified facilities. It made sense. You could get the sufficient volume both on the supply side and on the demand side to be able to make that realistic and viable. With something like soy, it's simply the sheer scale of those operations. It often means that the cost of segregation down that supply chain would render it whole prohibitive. So again, some opportunities here, but actually some of the shift to more area-based measures, I think, and these jurisdictional approaches was partly down to the concerns and the limitations that people saw around certification. Traceability, I think, has been a huge shift in the past 5 years, and it's really been very interesting, I think, to see. And there's different reasons behind that. I think Will's going to dig a bit more into that as to different drivers around the boost in traceability. But it's quite extraordinary, I think, sometimes with some of these commodities, how far we've managed to advance, even just in the past 5 years, harnessing new technology, new mechanisms. And I think a lot of it in the producer countries of really being able to bring a lot of progress in terms of how things can be identified and tracked, particularly to that sort of first point variation, whether it's a mill or different collection points. It's long sort of standing issue that we've seen has been that a lot of the traders, the really big commodity traders, they have their direct supply, and that has the traceability has been steadily improving over the past decade or so. Indirect supply chains remained a huge gap, and it's really only in the past couple of years that we've seen a big movement on that one. But it's great that it is finally being addressed. It can be, a huge proportion of a particular trader's supply that was simply, it was unknown where it was coming from. And therefore, as I say, the ability to shift the incentives towards more sustainable production and to reward more sustainable production, they get really lost, I think, sometimes if the traceability is not there. The diagram at the bottom is from a very simplified version of a soy supply chain. And I think, in some of these supply chains, traceability, what we often see is a bit of a broken chain still. So I think particularly with something like soy, where you see a real consolidation at the point of shipping and of import into countries like the UK, but then it fans back out again into multiple different kinds of livestock production systems, and then it goes into different kinds of food manufacturing. It can be multiple times processed products. Getting that traceability all the way through the system is really difficult. And therefore, I think understanding what traceability we need at different points and how we can connect the dots, or whether actually there's particular control points or checkers that actually, as long as something is, everything is going in at that first point of aggregation, if that control point is really strong, and if the point of import control can be really strong, it can mean that then it takes the burden off having to have that full traceability all the way through and all of that wiring exposed right up and down the supply chain. So I think there's some really interesting advances that have been made there, and really trying to think about not getting so bogged in traceability. I've been in lots of conversations about traceability. It needs to be a means and not become an end in itself. You can get really obsessive about really knowing where all of the dots connect, and actually it's about understanding what traceability is useful and actionable at different points. Then we looked a lot, as Ruth was mentioning, we've spent huge amounts of time across many projects, across many years, working with our clients, understanding company commitments, what's out there, how are these different commitments being made, how far do they go? I think one of the things that's been really exciting is to see how some of them can be updated and how things can be pushed forward. I should say the data on this slide has, for palm and soy, has come from the Forest 500, who do a great job of tracking different kind of company policies and commitments. For cocoa, it's from our work with the Retailer Cocoa Collaboration, where we look at different policies and commitments that are out there. And I think there's been more and more, the Accountability Framework Initiative, sort of 5-6 years ago, is really important in helping to articulate what does good look like, what kinds of things make a clear commitment, what is some of the terminology that's out there, can we have a clear sense of what are the definitions. And then there's also been, I think, industry efforts, things like the Agriculture Sector 1.5 degree roadmap, which was really about trying to align some of these commitments as well, and a sense of where we can really get the whole sector starting to move together. Some of these questions then around segregation, about what level of traceability you need, it becomes easier because the whole market is shifting in a particular direction. The ultimate, I would say, in that one is hopefully what I have in my next slide, which is around regulation, which is around really trying to actually lock in some of this kind of commitments that have been made and shift the baseline forward. And this is what we were really, keen to see with something like the EU deforestation regulation coming in, is where actually a deforestation-free supply chain becomes the legal minimum. And therefore it opens up the space ahead of that to think, well, actually, where next? What more can companies be doing? How can we keep pushing these commitments forward? And it really sort of, brings up companies that have not been making these commitments, that have been, not helping to really try and address the issue and the real concerns and risks that deforestation creates in terms of the resilience and the viability of those supply chains. So regulation is obviously a huge topic, looking across the different commodities. There's different countries which dominate in each of these supply chains, but there's many more countries obviously that are involved, and these patterns are shifting. was interesting talking yesterday about cocoa and how we're sort of seeing shifts as more and more countries are planting, and particularly Latin America is becoming a taking greater interest in cocoa production. So some of these kind of producer countries, all of them, I think, have got different policies. None of them are unaware of sustainability as it's playing out in their particular landscapes. There's real social dimensions to this. There's huge amounts of the workforce that are involved in these huge global supply chains, the sheer level of production. These are really important to livelihoods, to economies, to tax bases for these countries. Equally, deforestation, I think, all countries around the world have made commitments to try to address it, to try to bring it under control, recognizing the risks that it causes both for them domestically and also the global picture as well. But I think, getting that consistency of policy, as I say, I think Brazil, there has been real challenges. There's been some advances, particularly looking back 5 years ago, enforcement, I think, around tackling deforestation and legality in Brazil. There's been huge advancements. At the same time, there's been real challenges politically around where the policy is going. Indonesia has made real progress on some points. There is real issues there, I think, with some of the policy coherence. Many of these countries are facing elections. Obviously, that can sort of shift how things are happening. On the demand side countries, looking at sort of import of deforestation, 2 or 3 years ago, things were looking really exciting. We had the EUDR that was passed in the middle of 2023. The US was tabling the Forest Act. The UK was intending to lay secondary legislation relating to the Environment Act, the UK Environment Act. All three of these, I think, the EUDR remains in force. It's due to come in at the end of this month. But there is, votes going on. There's been all kinds of back and forth for different parts of the EU political machinery. The US, no idea what's happening under the Forest Act, unfortunately. And similarly, we've not really had an update on the UK legislation. And I think recognizing how these things can work together and the strengths that you get when these start to mutually reinforce and align with each other is really where we need to see a lot more progress happening over the next few years. Payment for ecosystem services, I think this is a huge area. I won't try and touch on it now. This is really about trying to get this sense of a shared interest in having a resilient and healthy landscape, which means a productive one, good livelihoods, good well-being for the people within that landscape, but also maintaining across multiple different indicators. Forests are so incredibly valuable for their, all kinds of different ecosystem benefits that they bring us, as well as human benefits, as well as obviously climate change and carbon emissions, which has dominated the conversation in some circles. And I think this real idea of trying to identify programs which can connect the dots and connect them. So this diagram comes from the LENS model, which is the one that 3Kill, our colleagues, are working on. Actually, unfortunately, not yet in any tropical rainforest countries, but who knows where the future lies. But this idea of really being able to connect demand side and producers in a shared interest in having a healthy, resilient landscape that's delivering across multiple values, and really strong monitoring and verification of the outcomes to give everyone confidence that you're moving in the right direction. I think also things like insetting are becoming more and more interesting, where you can get companies to start to invest back down the supply chain, looking beyond the direct supply, which obviously has been their real sort of key business interest, but in actually understanding how we're going to maintain that as a resilient, high quality supply that is available over time. And I think, insetting, again, looking to sort of climate targets, carbon ambitions. This was some work that 3Kill did with Conservation International, which is looking at insetting as a mechanism. Again, how do we get funding and resourcing back into the landscapes where deforestation is occurring, and really reward and ensure that we're incentivizing, sustainable approaches that aren't deforesting. And looking at the levels of investment that we've seen over the past sort of, 5-10 years, these are just figures that are in the public domain. So hopefully they are underestimates. But you can see some commodities are attracting much more investment, have attracted much more investment from companies than others. Of course, they're occurring in different countries. There could be different reasons behind this, but I think there's a real need here to think about how the downstream actors are able to invest directly into these production methods, because that's really where we're going to be able to stop deforestation. So We were keen to have a bit of a poll, actually. Having gone through, you've seen some have probably picked up already, which are the mechanisms I think is sort of seeing having the most promise as we look ahead. But our overwhelming feeling from all of this and from looking back at what's been tried is that we need to be pivoting, we need to be developing, we need to be really thinking about how we move forwards. But we don't need to start over. We actually have a really good menu of different tools, different mechanisms that can help to tackle deforestation. So we're really interested in doing a quick poll to see what you all felt. Hopefully it's popped up on your screen in terms of which do you think has the most promise in really helping us to meet 2030 as this ambition. We have to get deforestation under control. So yeah, keen to see the results that come through and whether it broadly tallies with our thinking, which yeah. So those of you who've read the report will already seen where our thoughts lie, but really interested to see what those on the call think. We've got some scores on the doors. Ah, okay. Interesting. So yes, I think similar to us, we'd simply grouped ours between those that we sort of saw as having remaining potential and those with limited further potential. But I think definitely regulation, yeah, and payment for ecosystem services. It's great to see those coming out really strongly as areas where we think there's a lot more potential for things to move forward and there's a lot more scope for ambition. Interestingly, it didn't look like company commitments was one that was particularly popular with others on the call. I think it's something where we're interested to see how those can evolve actually, and particularly where we can, I guess, where regulation helps to kind of underpin things and help to move company commitments forward, and where we can therefore drive company commitments into to the next level, and similarly linking, I guess, to that payment for ecosystem services and where, particularly downstream companies can be making those commitments as to how they're going to invest in really smart ways back into resilient landscapes. Great. So in terms of kind of looking ahead and trying to sort of really think about what we've learned and where it takes us forward, I think co-delivery is something that has come out for us as being really critical. I think these partnerships across producers, consumers, down the supply chain, across supply chains, also recognizing that sometimes we're seeing multiple commodities in shared landscapes and therefore sometimes treating those in isolation and as silos can be unhelpful. I think co-delivery, remains really critical. Forests underpin climate and human development goals. SDG 15 is the one that particularly pertains to deforestation, but we've sat before and tried to map out where you can actually get forests against all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're hardwired into, country national development plans generally. They're part of the national determining contributions that are going into the UNFCCC. They're so fundamental. Producer finance needs to be about real investment, meaningful investment, and this real shared investment and a shared accountability for how we build resilience in landscapes. Any narrative which is focused on donations, I think, is going to be vulnerable as we see, cost pressures increasing, different regulatory pressures or, reputational issues and all the rest of it. Whereas core investment in actually a resilient supply base, it makes real business sense. Regulation, absolutely, we would agree with all the majority of those on the call who feel that it's what really is going to drive transformation of the markets at sort of that universal scale rather than simply being about coalitions of the willing. And then obviously visibility is really important. We've only been able to work with what data we can see because it's in the public domain. Impact is obviously matters. That's the fundamental, that's the critical, and having that. But I think, being able to really also talk about some of those impacts and explain how you can understand those impacts has also been a really valuable tool. So in terms of looking ahead and where we go next, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Will, who's going to walk through some of that.
Great. Thanks, Anna. So it's a useful walkthrough of just when we sat down a few months ago as a team within 3Kill and just were looking to say, what is it that we'd be looking to tell the market about what happens next? As Ruth kind of teed up at the start of the call today, a number of organizations have commitments that are through 2025, and that kind of question of Where are we prioritizing our investment? Where are we prioritizing our engagement with the limited capital that we have with working with the supply chain? It needs to be focused on doing things that are going to be the most impactful and helpful in actually moving the needle once and for all to eradicating deforestation from supply chains. So pulling all this together, it's not always that we're unique in sitting down here. We'd love to think that we are all the time, but there's always the zeitgeist moment, and everybody who is really engaged within deforestation, I think, have been challenged with kind of where is it that we can really build on the successes. And WWF just released this report during COP, which is about looking at real case studies and examples to show where effective action is already taking place, and that's certainly what we were seeing too. It's the the last 5 years. It's not just been about kind of the traceability. It's largely been putting in the mechanics that are needed for scaling, and it's the same story when you talk about climate kind of initiatives right now too, which is we're sort of beyond the point of pilots and it's now about implementation. So what is it that we're looking to implement, and what's driving that kind of unlocking of whether it's going to be resource or finance to really drive the change that's now needed? As Anna referred to, and what's the majority opinion of those on the calls today too, regulation cannot be underestimated as being one of the critical drivers. 3 years ago, before EUDR was adopted, we would speak with traders and others in the supply chain who would say EUDR was never going to happen. There was no chance that the European Union was going to do this. It was going to be too complicated and everything. We've had the delays. There are, of course, issues with that, and there's reasons for it. But we're also hearing those same traders and those same organizations now saying, don't delay the EUDR because we've actually now invested in the systems and supply chains that are needed to deliver against them. Now, without it's not even the threat of legislation, but the EUDR is past legislation. If nothing happens in the trilogue and they don't agree between the Commission, the Council, and Parliament as to what the way forward is, then on the 30th of December 2025, in a few weeks' time, EUDR is live and everybody needs to be compliant who's regulated within that regulation. And that's what's driven the substantial change that we've seen, particularly in the direct supply chains of companies. But the indirect supply chains are still lagging behind and they're just starting to catch up. And I think it's important to just articulate what we mean when we say direct and indirect on this too, because we've talked a bit about that on the webinar so far, and just being clear. A direct supply chain is always going to be when you're a company and you're buying directly from a farmer. So you know where the landscape is, you know who your raw material suppliers are, and you can do an assessment to see if deforestation and conversion has taken place. When you're talking about indirect, you're still buying the same product. It could be a soybean or a vat of palm oil that's coming through, but you're buying it from somebody else who bought from the farmer. And therefore, you're beholden to, can they give you any information around where their sourcing came from, specific to your products or not. And that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult, because you get into even just issues of commercial confidentiality, where it might be that the company that you're buying from doesn't want to disclose it because they think that you're going to bypass them and buy directly from the farmers where that take place. These are the arguments that we've heard for over a decade in terms of what the challenges are. Regulation has been the thing that kind of railroads through that to say, no, this is not commercially confidential information. You have to figure out other ways of protecting those situations from occurring, in whether it's going to be mechanisms of transparency and disclosure, whether it's about assurance. But the basic matter of needing to make sure that somebody can have the traceability and the claims to say it's deforestation free and to do that assessment, that is being driven by legislation. And that is the reason why we could see such a steep uptick in advance of 2024, which is when the EUDR was originally supposed to really be active with requirements starting this year in 2025. We'll see if it's going to be in a few weeks' time, or if it's going to be another year, or if there's going to be something else that comes down the road, hopefully within the coming hours or days, at least within the EU context. We don't know what's going on in the UK or US, but we, of course, have been engaging with them. But we have to be clear that without regulation, there will not be further progress on this. The companies that are taking action and care about compliance, they've done it. And where there's the consumer markets, where there's a requirement, they've invested in the systems to do this right now and the supply chains to deliver it. If there's not further enforcement and actual enforcement here, it undermines a lot of the business cases that have already been put together. But critically, it's not going to address those companies that are operating in other markets that don't have legislation right now, because they will say, well, Europe tried to do it. It was complicated. They abandoned it. Why would we address any legislation in that effect? So it kind of has a chilling effect on other markets, but it also will undermine all the work in the private sector that's been done to move towards compliance to date. Now, while we talk about regulations being kind of critical to being moving some things forward, it is not the only thing, especially when you look at where those regulations are occurring and where they're not occurring. Because when you have a regulated market, we know that we'll be able to get deforestation free or deforestation and conversion free. That's the difference between DF and DCF, because the European deforestation regulation is only currently attracting or controlling deforestation supplies. But it's all being mixed together wherever that market is making those requirements. And if the market doesn't have the requirements, then you're looking at just, well, what are the company commitments that are underway to deliver deforestation and conversion-free supply? And as Anna just went through, there's been good progress on that. And a number of them have said they are going to be delivering on their 2025 goals here, but they don't buy all raw materials in the world. And not all raw materials, therefore, have a commitment for deforestation and conversion free. And when we look at where the risk is of not addressing deforestation and getting this wrong, so the climatic changes and weather events, and they're causing drought and yield and disease to spread within these production landscapes, we need to bring everybody with us. And that's where the question then comes into really around payment for ecosystem services about changing how it is that we're engaging in a landscape and not just looking about having, your own comfort at night, thinking that your supply chain is fine and therefore there is no risk. There is a risk, it's a resilience one, and the cost pressures that would be there aren't going to be going away, just as we've seen with the cocoa sector over the last couple of years in terms of the extreme volatility that's happened with pricing in that market, which has driven some of the substitution that Anna's were referring to earlier as well. The good news is that there's lots of new tools that are coming online. The accountability framework is an organization that's been referred to already within the webinar. It's a collection of 23 environmental and human rights organizations that are all aligned and saying this is what good practice looks like and a credible way of addressing deforestation and maintaining action on it after you've achieved your various implementation goals. They did a consultation back in January and February, and the outcomes of that have been worked on over the past year. And in the next couple of weeks, we should have the publication of that. And I am sure that come January, 3Kilo, as well as I'm sure a host of other organizations will be doing some support workshops and webinars and how it is that you can apply those within your organizations. But really, when we look at what's changing and how have things evolved, there's a huge emphasis around transparency, around approaches, and having clarity for action plans for addressing nonconformances where they're occurring. As the representatives for the retail soy group, we've already been working on how it is that we build upon the updated guidelines and the conversations that have been happening there to create a bit of a model policy that if you're a retailer, we can adapt what the concepts are and the requirements of the AFI into the experiences that we've had as a sector in saying this is how we can apply this in practice, leveraging the areas of influence that we have to unlock both the investment and the supplier requirements that would be needed and the transparency that would support effective monitoring, not just inside the own organization, but also allow accountability outside of the organization for commitments and actions that have been taken forward. This integration across sustainability continues not just from kind of the broad elements of environmental sustainability, but even within it. And nowhere can we see this clearer than within climate. The Science-Based Targets Initiative that has flag guidelines, food, and agriculture. Those say that everybody should be having a 2025 implementation target for deforestation free. And this whole scope 3 carbon insetting agenda is really rising up the agenda. The accountability framework work with at Astra, which has an excellent database that's really allowing companies to have more nuanced understanding and more accurate understanding of the land use change emissions associated with their scope 3 profiles or inventories. And you can see that when you look at tropical commodities, the potential for this from their now a recent case study that was just produced a couple of weeks ago is significant. And how it is that we can make sure that the supply chain action that can then drive the change on the landscape so that you can make these types of claims is increasingly important and has still challenges associated with this. One of those is going to be explored in a paper that's going to be published in the next couple of weeks as well. That's being done by the WWF and the Responsible Commodities Facility, which is one of those initiatives that does payment for ecosystem services. We've been working with them on a whole end-to-end value chain assessment and engagement process to understand the levels of traceability that are possible at each stage of the supply chain to enable the complexities of these soft commodity systems to not be a barrier for unlocking climate finance for supporting producers on the ground. There are things that we need to be very pragmatic about, particularly around when we talk about the evil words of mass balance and this kind of continued challenge of it being different when you say mass balance in a climate and carbon accounting type framework versus mass balance in a deforestation and conversion-free commitment and delivery framework. And those definitions create this kind of butting of heads, in addition to some of the complexities around carbon accounting that says just where and how much data needs to be primary in each leg of the supply chain in order to make sure that you can have a credible way of producing an inventory that doesn't have double accounting. So we're certainly looking at pragmatic pathways, and the good news is that we're going to have case studies to show those pragmatic pathways and ways in which that you can take this forward in the next couple of weeks too. So there is a lot happening, and there's more coming down the road. But it's not something that means that we have to wait for all that in order to have very clear recommendations for businesses to take action on. And, first and foremost, it's making sure that you're playing to your strengths. This is something that we've been quite clear about, is that businesses have been asked to do a lot of things so far that don't always work on it. And it may not work from a commercial perspective. It may not work because raising, embedded soy within livestock products as a retailer isn't really that helpful because customers don't understand those issues. And there's always going to be an argument to say that the retailer might be closest for making some of these claims and doing consumer education. But there's only so much that you can do on that, especially when it comes to some of the complex issues where there's no chance a consumer's ever going to pick up a liter of milk off the shelf and see, deforestation-free soy included in that and not have questions associated with that. The second one is going to be that we've got lots of materials available in terms of sharing and following best practice. And as a sector, the growth of pre-competitive coalitions continues. And these have to be supported, not just in terms of the membership, but also the role of regulators in being really clear about what falls within competition law and what clearly doesn't. And we still have challenges with that, even in the UK, where the Competition and Markets Authority has created this lovely guidance document. And we've gone 2 or 3 times to them to say, what about this initiative or that initiative? And it goes right back to the basics of competition law and is a really complicated process in order to get kind of the rubber stamp that says this is all fine. But it's happened. And groups like Fair Trade have actually gone through that whole process too and have provided kind of templates and materials that others can use for that type of engagement. But that is the whole point. Even if you're a certification organization or you've got private sector experience in developing things, sharing that so that we can accelerate progress is really key. Recognizing shared exposure is going to be that next thing about how is it that you can create the business case for investing in a landscape when you don't buy the product and you don't know who the farmer is. That shared exposure work is really critical. And some of that's what we've been doing with the Landscape Enterprise Network lens that Anna referred to before. It's also things that with the responsible commodities facilities and others are able to look to too. And once you're able to make those connections and bring everything together, you can make sure that your investment case is solid because you can invest exactly where it matters most. So there's a lot more information and some background in the white paper that we published a couple of weeks ago, and we'll send that around with the webinar too. But for now, I'll hand it over to Nicola to share some of the reflections from from WWF's perspective.
Thank you. I'll be very quick because I'm conscious we're running out of time for questions. But I guess I'll just say that I want to recognise for everyone, I think pretty much everyone I'm sure who is in this call, it's been a deeply disappointing year on deforestation in supply chains, but we have actually achieved so much in the last 5 and 10 years, 20 years, in fact, in terms of where we've seen progress against different sectors and commodities. And whilst there is still alarming and increasing threats to forests, we aren't back in the 1990s yet. So I do think 3Kill's report here is really useful reflections on where we are and the potential for evolution, which I really want to press on that. So that doesn't mean we don't don't still need to be fighting on old ground. As we know with the Amazon soy moratorium, there's a lot of the retailers and others in the UK have really been pushing, and we need wider calls for that to really avoid unsustainable government subsidies being used to maintain increasingly unsustainable supply chains for your animal feed. The EUDR has led to so much transformation within traceability systems, making use of national and producer systems as well and reinforcing them. And whatever happens in 2026, they should be made use of and not stranded assets. And I think working with the likes of 3Keel and others to really reinforce why the business case for this will continue to be important and being a dynamic process. In terms of the evolution, I just want to press back onto the conversation about certification. There is a lot of potential to keep evolving how we use certifications. There's a reform of the R2RS discussions going on right now, which I welcome you all to be involved in. There has been recent corrections of how RSPO is working in Indonesia, which WWF have been involved in, and that will continue those corrections and making it a dynamic process where we review how it's useful as a tool and make it part of a wider strategy so that it doesn't continue just to be part of a small premium scale supply chain that won't actually address our wider goals. And then we've talked about investments in landscapes, of course, investing in farmers and investing in those communities that are protecting the forests. Many of the companies on this call are already doing that in some places. But I think bringing that back into the recommendations from this 3Keel report is being transparent about what we're doing, what we're not doing, recognizing that if you're hiding the problem, it's not going to get any support. So working with others to be brave and bold in being transparent, and then also being transparent as we have been recently in reporting on the time to act case studies that are working around the globe to enable DCF supply chains, and also writing up really concept notes and reports that go directly to banks and governments to show this and build confidence into what can be achieved in the new year. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nicola. That's brilliant. Really interesting to hear WWF's perspectives there. So now time for Q&A. Do add any in. We'll try and get through a couple just with the last few minutes remaining. So firstly, Anna, a question for you. So this is around the visibility piece that you spoke on as being essential. Does visibility of outcomes and programs on deforestation matter, considering kind of the current political climate that we're seeing in the US in particular?
Oh gosh, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's obviously a really difficult time for business. Anything that's sort of, putting your head over the parapet is feeling like it's a very volatile time. I think at the same time, consistency, I think, is often a really important thing. And I think to be credible, I think businesses need to be consistent in what they're doing and how they're doing it. So the extent to which they sort of, want to sort of, publicize and put out press releases and all the rest of it, I think often, particularly in these producer landscapes, having yourself visible as a presence that is a partner in resilience, a partner in the future, and all the rest of it. I think the visibility in some of these scenarios is really key. And I think having that real kind of consistency and understanding why you're doing it and being clear on why you're doing it. And I think, again, it's not in the land of the sort of donations and sort of, pure goodwill. I think it's also about really understanding and articulating there is a really shared solid interest, business interest here in having sustainable production landscapes that will continue to produce and to support people and wildlife for infinity. So yeah.
Thank you, Anna. One for you now, Will, considering you kind of touched on the overlap a bit between deforestation and climate. So do you think there is a need for corporate greenhouse gas accounting methods, such as Scope 3, to evolve to better differentiate between compliant and non-compliant supply chains, for example, commodity-specific emission factors that reflect EUDR compliant sourcing? If so, what challenges do you see in implementing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are constantly coming up against some of the methodology challenges, and they're linked to a bit of a history of how carbon accounting evolved from an academic exercise around life cycle assessment 30 years ago into something that's been tried to become a tool for businesses to make active decisions on. And there are specific issues around like the 20-year kind of allocation process between a deforestation event and when you could say it's deforestation free, as well as the kind of the traceability side of things that kind of come together. So there's a whole cocktail of issues in carbon accounting that do need to be addressed. But the case study that I kind of popped up from Ad Astra and the accountability framework starts to show that as businesses are able to leverage all that success that they've had in terms of enhancing traceability, we need a pragmatic solution that tries to balance the point at which you can have commercial relationships to say, yes, you've got commercial connections back to a particular landscape, and therefore you have a valid insetting a business case and justification for including within your inventory for action, versus an unrealistic expectation of physical traceability from a particular landscape all the way down to it could be a consumer goods brand or a retailer. Now, even the EUDR has had some pragmatism in that too, with their guidelines of having something called declaration in excess, which means that you could just say it's any one of these. And it's not identifying a specific farm that might be included within a due diligence statement. It's all the sourcing that is. And we need that same type of pragmatism to be working through within carbon too, which isn't right now in terms of the specific guidelines that are out there.
Thank you, Will. That takes us to time. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. If there is anything you would like to discuss that you haven't had a chance to cover off in the Q&A, we will be following up, as Will mentioned, with the webinar recording and also all of our email addresses if you would like to get in touch. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Hope it's been an interesting and engaging session for yourself. And please do stay in touch. All the best.